Pleased to meet you again. I came back. Actually, I made an effort to pursue coherence and integrity of this class. Although I am beginner on online class in this term, I'm afraid if the dealings is a little kaleidoscopic or discursive in some context. So this class will help you to get on a short bench about a convergence and divergence, and I suppose it is one of a destination that both legal traditions need to seriously consider on the dynamism. So the article, as I've introduced, was also by Murray and Glendon. It featured in Creighton Law Review in 1984. They also presented same on 4 subtitles, the many varieties of statute law, the decline of precedent, the rise of administrative, and the rise of public law. So actually, in most fundamental context, the state usually have the occasion of a codification. For example, the United States Constitution is a notorious example, and the Code of Napoleon also represents the political interaction in the specific society. Then, do you think if the jurists usually admit the business in the form of a small town, or for the familiar face with their familiar faces of neighborhoods in many individualist contexts, that would be perhaps true in the context of a long traced a British common law tradition, as we later explore briefly. But the culture of a codification may come in a more civilized a dynamism in some sense, but there are also some elements involved to see the progress over the world history. For example, the higher concept would rather be invented from the efforts of the works of a common law jurist in this case, and they also influence the European tradition to make a constitutional tribunal for the constitutional review. However, the statute law would be less frequented in modern times until the 18th and 19th century have arrived. The relative predominance of various sources of law is now quite remarkably at variance with the classical common and civil law descriptions. In addition, and equally important, the very nature of 2 of the main sources, legislation and case law, has been profoundly altered since these descriptions were formulated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The fundamental changes that have taken place have produced a significant areas of convergence between civil and criminal systems, casting doubt on the utility of many of the traditionally accepted distinctions between the common and the civil law. The traditional ways of thinking about the materials of legal reasoning began to be unsettled by the discovery proclaimed by several 9th century writers in Europe and the United States that the judicial function is not merely a mechanical process of finding and applying legal norms contained in early cases or in legislation. Von Jelling in Germany, Bentham and Austin in England, Holmes in the United States, and Gini in France all effectively demolished the illusion of the internal logic and completeness of the law. So, do they effectively expel the practices of status in the theory? What do you think about that? While the judges were often engaged in a creative lawmaking process, held the attention of the academy. However, time-honored methods of thinking and communicating about law were being decisively and permanently affected by events in a rapidly changing society. 5 aspects of transition from market to mixed and regulated economies, in particular, undermine classical sources of law notions: the rise of legislation, the increasing variety of legislation, the decline of precedent in common law, the emergence of administrative law, and the expansion of functions of state. Starting in the late 19th century, in both civil and common law systems, there was an outpouring of a kind of legislation which displaced both judgment common law and the continental civil codes with essentially the same kind of new law. What kind of law was this? It belonged to the age of what was then called universal suffrage and to the spirit of men like Jeremy Bentham, who believed the legislation could and should be used as a scientific instrument of social reform and control. National legislatures, elected by increasingly a broader constituencies, adopted a factory legislation, workmen's compensation laws, rudimentary a social legislation, and laws regulating employment contract, and began to regulate commerce and public utilities. This modern legislation removed great areas wholly or partially from the coverage of judgment common law in the Anglo-American systems and from the civil codes in the continental systems. Moreover, it not only took territory from these traditional sources, but it was fundamentally inconsistent with the underlying ideologies of protection of private property and enforcement of private ordering through contract. Then, in the first part of the 10th century, mainly in response to economic crisis, a second wave of modern legislation appeared. Legislature in industrialized countries came to the assistance at different times and to varying degrees of farmers, debtors, and unemployed workers. The state started to attend systematically to the elementary needs of its disadvantaged citizens. Each country laid down the main lines of its legal treatment of industrial relations. The administrative apparatus of the modern state began to take on its present contours. What is of particular interest to us in this oft-told tale is how academic lawyers did and did not respond to the new situation. The growing importance of statute as sources of law in the United States of the first half of the 20th century was early remarked upon by Pound and Landis in articles which are now regarded as classics. In 1947, Felix Frankfurter wrote that as late as 1875, more than 40% of the controversies before the Supreme Court were a common law litigation. 50 years later, only 5%, while today cases not resting on statute are reduced almost to zero. In 1982, Guido Calabrese summed up the long trend. The last 50 to 80 years have been a fundamental change in American law. In this time, we have gone from a legal system dominated by the common law, defined by codes, to one in which statutes enacted by legislature have become the primary source of law. In the civil law country, of course, legislation had been the primary source of law since the acceptance of the parliamentary supremacy, with the great 19th century codification of civil law enjoying a pride of place. What is interesting there is that the civil codes have receded steadily in importance, as more and more of the matters with which they concern have become the subject of what civil lawyers call a special legislation. The ever-growing body of separate statutes reinforces the traditional preeminence of enacted law within civil law systems, but diminishes the influence of the codes themselves. The important position of statutes alongside case law in the common law and codes in the civil law is now well recognized. Indeed, the only place where this aspect of modern legal life seems to be insufficiently appreciated is in the usual law school curriculum. It has been less widely noticed, however. The modern enacted law differs in kind both from all the common law statutes and from the great continental codifications. There is not just more of it. It now comes in a greater variety. Some of these varieties are new in the relatively brief history of legal regulation. Part of the reason we do not notice this is because we use the single word statute to describe many different types of legislation. For example, in the common law system, there are still statutes of sort known to Blackstone, mere restatements of or patches on the common law. There are also statutes of the kind to which Pound and Landis devoted much attention, which potentially establish new principles or directions for the common law. But in addition, and in the United States especially, since the New Deal, the body of statute law has been greatly augmented by what one may call a bureaucratic law. The statute, which create regulatory agencies with broad delegated powers to make rules and to adjudicate, and the great laws of the welfare state, revenue-raising laws, social security laws, and the various public assistance laws. To the extent that the regulatory laws which increasingly dominate modern legal systems tend to be highly detailed and specific. They create a world of their own in which the role of judgment law is limited. Insofar as such legislation represents the temporary compromise of conflicts among organized interests or the pressures of narrow interest groups rather than any coherent view of the public interest. It poses a special interpretive problems for judges who must attempt to apply it. The judge's search for a guiding principle or policy may be futile. Such statutes often have multiple purposes, some of which may be in tension or conflict with each other. Just as modern statutes in common law systems have little resemblance to their 19th century predecessors, there are significant differences between modern continental legislation and the 19th century codes. The civil codes, which now constitute only a small part of the total volume of existing legislation in such countries, tend to lay down general principles rather than to provide specifically for particular situations. Ordinary legislation does not maintain the same level of generality, however, nor is characterized by as much conceptual and terminological consistency as other codes. Regulatory legislation such as land use control, tax law, wage and price control, labor law, rent and eviction control, so forth, is more particularistic and more sensitive to political and economic currents than the codes. The fact is that legislatures have often found it hard to make necessary reforms within the structure of the hollow civil code, especially where the interests of organized economic groups are affected. They have resulted instead to statutes outside the codes, which are more easily amended as constellations of interest and power shift and as a circumstances change. Modern statutes in civil law systems require different approaches from those brought to the interpretation of codes. In both the Anglo-American and Romano-Germanic systems, therefore, statutes are not only pervasive but increasingly regulatory, volatile, and little related in form and spirit to the formal primary sources of law. So the social context is remarkably distinctive from across the ages. The circumstantial change is a critical factor that the jurists endeavor would be pushed forward. And also you can see the similar dynamism in contemporary times. The technological development now enables us to use an internet device for illustration. So there would be some high necessities that the law should incorporate the change into a kind of institution, and the statute may have to respond to the delicate points of a transformation to adapt to the human command, for example. The increased volume of enacted law of all kinds in modern Western legal systems has increased the necessity for its construction, interpretation, and application by code. Thus, in this sense, a common law codes have become more like their civil law counterparts in that they are now largely engaged in dealing with enacted law. But in neither system are traditional techniques of interpretation particularly well suited to the task of dealing with the various types of modern statutes. This brings us to the next point, which concerns changes in judgment law. So, what change can we chart? The decline of precedent is one point we have to think about. One of the major differences between case law in common law system and case law in the civil law is that the judicial function in the civil law system traditionally been regarded as limited to deciding particular cases, while common law courts are not only supposed to settle disputes between the parties before the court, but also to give guidance as to how similar disputes should be handled in the future. The reasoned elaboration of precedent has traditionally been the principal device for achieving the optimum balance between continuity and growth in Anglo-American law. Changes occurring over the 20th century, however, have considerably affected the function of the common law courts. We have already noted that the proliferation of regulatory law, while affording an abundance of occasions for litigation, does not necessarily offer the court a wide scope of interpretation or for reasoning from principles contained in statute. Second, courts in the United States, especially federal courts, have increasingly been called to rule upon problems of social conflict, which cannot easily be resolved by the reasoned elaboration of principle. And usually the civil matters, including a commerce, for exclusive falls within the jurisdiction of each state, a respective state. The matters exclusively reserved in the federal constitution could come into play when we review the federal jurisdiction in legal terms. But so the common law usually grounded on the state context. The principal actors to develop a case law is the state court. In modern times, we are careful to identify some primitive form of a federal common law, which is very hard in understanding our traditional rules about a common law preserve. But some commentators are working on the system of federal common law, which is very unusual. And also, the federal code actually is limited in their role, since they have to apply the state common law in which they are situated in the jurisdictional terms. So we have about 100 federal jurisdiction involving the district court, the scope of district courts, and we have a certain circuit court, which is expected to play a role as an appellate review body, and the final authority was found in the Supreme Court, United States. And in some occasions, the case may be brought into a full relegations in terms of levels of authority. So 4 times review may be possible, which is different from the Korean practices, where is tertiary letters, which is expected and by constitutional drafters. But the point is that the federal jurisdiction has taken active a viewpoint about the civil matters. So they are one of a critical players to restore the conscience of society and a basic virtue of a humanity. The kind of a bad nature of a capitalism may well be cured in practical ways by the initiative of federal courts. And so, sorry to interrupt your attendance. So, my mobile phone. Okay, never mind. So, and third, the decisions of the United States Supreme Court in important cases in recent years often show little effort on the opinion writers' part to build a bridge to pre-existing authority. They often seem to simply balance the interests involved or react to the facts of the particular case. Frequently, they appear to be merely the products of a majority vote. So, let me a little further on the point. So, the court authority is usually charged with a protection of a minority interest. As you see, the Congress represents the majority force in the society. I have to silence the mobile phone, sorry. So, what? Then the major class of a political powers in the given society are usually well represented in the Congress. So the basic deliberation would go to the Supreme Court when we consider the need to protect the insular or discrete minority. So, but there are also institutional flaws intrinsically applied to the judiciary. They are a passive branch, and they are usually forbidden from any initiative to shape a public policy as an initiative way. So the kind of a delicate context of a separation of power principle may get you to the point about this area of discussion. Finally, there seems to have been a significant change in the very nature of a decision making in common law courts generally. This change concerns the relative importance of two traditional functions of common law case law, that of settling the dispute between the parties and that of providing a principal guidance for the future. As Pierce Attia pointed out in his inaugural lecture at Oxford University in 1978, there is apt to be a tension between these two functions. A decision which the justice in all the circumstances of the case is often likely to conflict with the desire to encourage or discourage certain types of behavior in the future. Attia makes a convincing case which seems to be applicable at least as much to the United States as to England. The modern common law courts are less inclined than the 19th century predecessors to resolve disputes by adhering to principle and are giving much greater weight to the problem of individualized justice in the particular case. I do not suggest that we should uncritically accept their thesis. In particular, it seems to me that the way facts were found and the outward appearance of principled decision-making in the 19th century must have masked some very subjective judgments in many cases. But to the extent that Attia is correct, Anglo-American judicial decisions have quietly come to assume, in fact, a role similar to that ascribed in theory to decisions of civil law courts. While there does seem to have been a certain diminution in the role of precedent in the common law, court decisions have increasingly come to be treated as important sources of law in the civil law systems. As a practical matter, it is now generally accepted in civil law systems the judges do and should take heed of a prior decision, especially when a consistent line of cases has developed. Civil and common law differ, of course. In the case law is said to be binding in the common law by the rule of stare decisis, while in civil law theory, cases are said to be of no authority apart from the intrinsic merits. Given the narrowness of doctrine of a stare decisis and the fact that decisions of certain high courts in several civil law countries have been made binding by statute, however, the sometimes asserted a contrast between civil and common law systems in this area begins to appear as more of a nuance than a major difference. Finally, as courts in the United States begin to delegate a brief reading and opinion drafting to large and layered staffs and increasingly to dispose of cases without opinion or with short memorandum opinions, another traditional legal distinction begins to fade, that between adjudication and administration. So with the style of a French code in legal aspect, of course, in legal technicalities, so the style of a common law jurist also changed, and so the kind of cultivating a problem may once been raised by a Supreme Court, one of a Chief Justice in the United States, to meditate a very difficult issues of the case at bar, kind of point of a high level of a deliberation to strip off the true nature of the case. The kind of a deep involvement may well be waived by a compiled case laws, which may be made available into some set of principles, as we see in the restatement. The common law judges may have a specific interest. In some cases, they may go excoriating of some relationships involved in the case. So the change would well be monitored across the jurisdictions. The tension between fairness for the immediate parties and guidance for the situation type is complicated by the presence of other factors concerned for efficiency and system maintenance. No study of judicial process is complete in the United States, at least, that does not take account of the bureaucratization of courts. This has been one of the more recent manifestations of the changes in government, which earlier in the century produced in increasing quantities a kind of law that came to be known as also administrative. And you may see the practices of Westlaw, the first set of rules would be presented in principled way, so the rules from the court in very concise form, and details of a court opinion will feature later in the portion. So the information technology also influences the well-defined organization of a specific case laws. Then, starting in the late 19th century, as we have seen, modern statutes it began to displace case law in the common law system, and codes in civil law system as the predominant sources of law. Over the 20th century, administrative regulations and decisions become an increasingly important part of the legal landscape in modern states, rivaling both legislation and judicial decisions as sources of law. The phenomenon was soon reflected in the case law of federal courts. As Justice Jackson wrote in 1952, the rise of administrative bodies probably has been the most significant legal trend of the last century, and perhaps more values today are affected by their decisions than by those of older courts. Review of administrative decisions apart. Felix Frankfurter, who in 1947 had called the attention of the legal community to the great proportion of Supreme Court's work involving statutes, took up his pen in 1957 to write about the degree to which the Supreme Court by then was occupied with administrative law. Review of administrative action, mainly reflecting enforcement of federal regulatory statutes, constitutes the largest category of the court work, comprising 1/3 of total cases decided on the merits. Administrative law came into its own everywhere in the industrial West in the 20th century. New areas came under regulation. Government's role in providing social services increased. Despite sporadic and modest attempts at deregulation, as more areas of public concern are identified, such as protection of the environment or health and safety in the workplace, the scope of administrative law continues to expand. Today, in any highly developed Western legal system, the laws that have the most direct impact on the lives of most people, the laws that an ordinary person encounters most often in the course of a lifetime, are the predominantly administrative bodies of tax law, social security law, public assistance law, housing law, immigration and naturalization law, and so on. Administrative law as to modern case law and particularistic legislation, yet another source of law in which reckonability is problematic. Out of the necessity to deal with a multitude of unforeseeable day-to-day contingencies, it has to repose great confidence and discretion in officials. It is often, as Charles Sardis has said, an ad hoc creation, uncertain, volatile and easily affected by social, political, economic atmosphere changes. So, we also need to be tempered on the rise of administrative law. So the coherence and network need to be seriously considered, and which in some cases may recur the traditions of a case law. They may have a point to be traced back to the far early years case law. In some cases, the basic basics or fundamentals may lie in the context of a justice. Okay. And also, we may have one more element concerning the rise of public law. In classical common and civil law alike, the role of direct government intervention was supposed to be minimal. And it was assumed that two of the main functions of state were to protect a private property and to enforce legally formed a contract. From this individualistic base in which private law had predominated and property and contract reigned supreme, the civil and the common law systems alike began moving in the late 19th century toward modifying ownership rights, limiting or channeling the power of private persons to make their own enforceable contractual arrangements, and at the same time expanding the functions of the state. So we can see the area of mixed laws, and in some cases we term it a public law. So they are delicate to require the state to be an active player for a social justice beyond the fundamental rules of a civil society. So sanctity of a property concept and also the freedom of contract may have been well narrowed to define the public justice, so what they call the area of public law. In traditional private law areas, modern legislation established a new and competing set of premises. Freedom of contract was still enshrined in common law and the civil codes, but a variety of mandatory provisions prohibitions was introduced by statute in the name of a public interest. In the area of property, the common law and the codes still accorded a special place to private rights, but legislation qualified the property right by subtracting elements in the public interest or modified it by adding social obligations. The new area of labor law, like the common law of master and servant and the employment contract in civil codes, emphasized the group of the individual, downgraded the law of the will of the parties, and was replete with mandatory rules which could not be changed by agreement. So you can see the set of provisions, which is rather limited in many contexts, but the civil code now have a intrinsic deliberation about a mandatory rules, which could not be derogated by the parties' agreement. But there are also differences across the sections in the civil code. For example, in the section of private law, we have a scope of mandatory rules, which is extensive, since it involves the mandatory administration of a property system in the country. But in contrast, you can see a more limited extent of a mandatory rules in contract sections. In many places, too, also as 20th century war on course in the United States and Germany in particular began with and without direct or indirect legislative sanction to take upon themselves the task of conforming contract to judicially generalize notions of fairness and reasonableness. So in some cases, the judicial body may superimpose the rule as a substitute of the agreement to modify the Constitution to adapt to the requirement of a social justice. In many places, too, the authority of civil codes and the common law as sources of principles began to supersede it, not only by statute, but by constitutions. While private law was thus taking on an important public dimension, public law was being augmented by the body of rules necessary for the organization and management of public services. Just as a private law had been transformed by the idea that every person has social obligations, so public law had been transformed by the social functions of government, no longer limiting themselves to providing defense, police, and dispute settlement. A modern states directly and indirectly became involved in the provision of education, social assistance to the poor, transportation, electricity, post, telephone, and telegraph services, and numerous other public works and services. Contract and market were increasingly supplanted or supplemented as ordering mechanisms by a new kind of law regarding competition, the structure and activities of cooperation, and employer-employee relations. Yet, public authorities often used government contracts and private institutions to carry out their functions. All of these developments made it difficult to maintain another traditional distinction in legal theory between public and private law. The civil law systems have long been bedeviled by the formal division of the law school curriculum into public and private law, and of scholars on law faculties into publicists and privatists, with the result the workers in one field are sometimes unfamiliar with important developments in the other. So we have all of a regular session, what I call a colloquium, to interchange the ideas of a profession. Some kind of publicist may enable the privatist to be available of a new development of the areas of law, which would come into play for interaction, for social justice in some cases, and this theoretical debate also enriches the intelligence and culture of a jurist also. Through the common law lacks such a clear-cut and formal division of functions between public and private law specialists, it nevertheless suffers from a similar problems. Constitutional law scholars, who comprise many of our publicists and who often aspire to the jurisprudence on occasion, show little knowledge of or sensitivity to the law of the private order, or even that part of the work of Supreme Court, which is not concerned with a constitutional question. So the academics actually place to create the knowledge and to find some truth in it, and they also to devise some principles or tenets that have potential to be applied to the secular world. So also what is required is to encourage the interchange between the academics, particularly a college of law, and with a professional organization, for example, bar association, and also we the law school usually has offer a pro bono program where the students may experience the practical context of legal practices. They may have some learnings and also have chance to assist as a public consultant. And also we can see the dynamism of a legal actionism as once introduced in the context of a Harvard Wisconsin Law School. So the kind of interaction is seriously required to develop the professional circle of a jurist. Some about a privatist, on the other hand, teaches of property towards contract and family law, inhabit an essentially 19th century world, sustained in the illusion by teaching material that do not take sufficient account of the extent to which the private law subjects have come under statutory and administrative regulation, and to which the underlying premises have been irrevocably altered. So, then, we are now on the work to summarize our previous discussion thus far. Civil and common law systems alike were fundamentally transformed in transition from liberal laissez-faire governments to modern social welfare states with planned or regulated economies. In the process, the source of law that distinctively characterized each legal system and the legal methods associated with it lost their centrality. First, case law in the common law and cause in the civil law lost ground to modern statute. Second, judicial decisions in the common law were increasingly detached from the moorings in a precedent, while civil law judges were becoming more conscious of and willing to exercise their lawmaking powers. Finally, administrative law has encroached on all pre-existing sources of law. We have entered the age of legislation triumphant, the judge militant, and bureaucracy rampant. So we have some topology presenting the word a triumphant, a militant, and rampant. Do you agree? Taken together, the trends described above, the increase in regulatory and administrative law, the widening room for discretion, the transition from market to mixed economies, tend, as I've seen, to blur many of the usual distinctions made between the legal systems of civil law and common law countries. Drager and Quet state in their treatise on comparative law that the theory of legal families has so far proceeded as if the only law worth taking into account were what European lawyers call a private law. No doubt this has been due in part to the fact that comparatists have traditionally concentrated on private law. In the future, as comparative lawyers increasingly turn to the study of constitutional and administrative law, and to particular areas such as labor law and property, where public and private law are mixed, it is likely that Anglo-American and Romano-Germanic systems in developed countries will be seen as parts of single Western legal family. Within this family, it is probable the new and unconventional groupings of legal systems will emerge, and the country may be said to belong to given legal group for one purpose, but to others for other purposes. Already, differences between adversarial and non-adversarial systems, and between systems with greater or lesser degrees of judicial review, are the basis for new and important classifications. Neither the present-day Anglo-American systems nor the Romano-Germanic systems exist any longer in the form that at the turn of the century. The distinctive style of reasoning, which Max Weber called logical formal rationality, and contract, which I identify as the distinctive legal institution, are both in decline. Many of the differences that once seemed significant between the civil and the common law are becoming blurred or hazy, as are the great separations within legal systems between public and private law, courts and legislature, and formal adjudication and administration. In the new situation, the traditional mechanisms for maintaining reasonable predictability and continuity while permitting a flexibility and growth have fallen out of equilibrium. Traditionally, in common law, a predictability and continuity were afforded by legal rules developed in cases and by doctrine and practice of a stare decisis, while flexibility and growth were furnished by the rules of equity and the technique for limiting and distinguishing a precedent. In the codified systems of civil law tradition, predictability and stability were promoted by the written law of codes, while flexibility and growth were permitted internally by general clauses, tempering rigid rules, and externally by interpretation, made more supple by the absence of formal rule of a stare decisis. In both of these traditional systems, the present-day predominance of regulatory law has diminished the role of traditional mechanisms, case law and code, for maintaining continuity and reckonability. In this new situation, it will seem at first that the civil law systems have the methodological advantage in the techniques for statutory interpretation are now of more utility than are pure case law techniques. But in both systems, the use of traditional legal methods to gain relative predictability is of limited utility, because modern statute law, unlike the civil codes, generally is neither stable nor particularly rational. Its susceptibility to a frequent amendment does not introduce much flexibility in the traditional sense either, since it is not in the nature of the political process to develop legal rules on a reason or principle basis. The courts, for their part, are increasingly called upon to rule not only on particular dispute, but also on problems of social conflict, which often cannot be resolved by the reason elaboration of principle. Thus, both the civil and common law, still living on the Roman inheritance of legalism and administration, share common problems of legitimation in modern administrative states. So, I suppose, to the essence of a contemporary dynamism between both traditions. I initially planned to complete the legitimate problems, but I'm afraid the time is also short, which is hardly touch it, sorry. Over most cases of crisis, I have to say sorry. But I may speed up the rest of discussion since we have 10 minutes left. So we have some great insights from Professor Dawson, which is helpful for the civil law students. He is an expert from abroad and outside observers to fairly evaluate the merits and weaknesses of a German system. But his viewpoint is prevalently favoring the merits of a German system. It's very interesting, and his issue was focused on legitimation problems. He saw the United States is very weak to derives the points of legitimation in the justice practices, administrative justice. I'm afraid if you agree, principally the question of legitimacy derives from the civic virtue or democratic governance and the kind of a political discourse about the legal structure and a constitutional separation of each branch. Also it may involve the issue of sovereignty, keenly related with a concept of legitimacy. We generally infer this base origin from the course of development across times. We just see a French Revolution and independence of United States, independence war and Declaration of Independence and the proclamation of a Bill of Rights by the Virgin State, and also there are controversies about legitimacy involving the anti-majoritarian character of a constitutional law in some discrete circle of a intelligence. But actually we not fundamentally settled about the area of a controversy. For example, President Lincoln also suspect if the Supreme Court of the United States is sole authority to have a final say about the constitutional document in some cases. So the legitimate question is not fundamentally determined, but also take the nature of ongoing process, arousing scope of debates surrounding the political theory and also some philosophical points of a consideration. So Professor Dawson, so the practice of German code should be happier than the United States, since they have general principles benevolently allowed by the legislature, and they have no difficulty to found any political question of legitimacy, since a democratic representation was normally will be realized in the Congress. And he also saw that the diligence of a German jurist. They are very diligent, and they are very vigilant and effective through the process about interpretation of the general principle, general clauses, and development of case laws. And they also very active to develop a training program among the professionals if they identify a need to adapt with a new situation. In his word, this is because when the flood tide of case law unexpectedly came, German courts and legal scholars proceeded to train each other in developing navigational skills and direction-finding devices that are superior to those found elsewhere. And in his words, the misgivings we might have if American courts were to wander so far especially in the pursuit of high moral ideas, can be best explained by mentioning some aspects of your own good fortune. German legislation, almost all of it, applies uniformly nationwide. The German judiciary comprises a career service with promotion from within. At the summit led by a High Court, whose jurisdiction also is nationwide. Thus all judges can be forced to speak with one voice, and expert a critical literature can concentrate on one coherent body of legislation and a decisional law. I need hardly remind that in each of our 50 states there is an independent legislature grinding out a statute, and only rarely is the legislative model to which any will try to conform. There are 50 separate systems, of course, in no way bound by each other's decisions, and they likewise speak with discordant voices. Most judges in these systems are elected by popular vote, though this is not true in the 54th, the overarching hierarchy of a federal court. Our legal literature can be described as extensive. I have read complaints about the volume of German literature that has become unübersembar. Wait until you have 150 periodicals devoted exclusively to legal topics, plus perhaps 100 more the lawyer would do well to read, plus massive treatises and thousands of other books. The volume alone makes our legal literature unoverlookable, indeed, and ensures that its quality will remain diffuse and uneven. I do not say these things in a spirit of complaint, for we have become accustomed to this profusion, and on the whole, we enjoy our lot. I wish only to explain why German judges can be safely trusted with wide powers of innovation, though we will think wise for our own cause. So he perceives that the American jurists may have learned from the German practices. He is not definitely pessimistic about American practices of jurists, but some point of lessons may well be drawn from a German practices to make some cure about the flaws of a American institution. And also, his point is fairly extensive. Let's see, on this I have only at this point I only raise the question whether the zeal and extreme self-confidence shown by the right-gallery judges in the most spectacular adventure in the inflation cases of 1950s was not due in part to their own deeply felt conviction that they were left as the direct and only spokesman for the moral values of all Germans. So he has only 2 points. That such delusions, no matter how firmly they may bear, almost certainly serve to describe personal prejudices and one-sided views of social polish at a much more mundane level, too mundane to mention, and that such abstractions charged with the emotion that the sense of mission generates remove the incentives for close and careful reasoning and tend to block of thought. Our country has the best example to offer. The United States Supreme Court, which during the 19th century discovered the entrance into the sanctuary of electoral law, was allowed to view the tablets in a private showing and continued to wear the white robes for a long time thereafter, well into the present century. As to German codes, I only venture to comment that since the 1920s, the missionary jail seems to have receded somewhat. So, also, it is compatible and interchangeable that the lesson of can be drawn from the case of United States. So in 1920s, in 1920s, the German practice also revealed some shortcomings and some distortions that the jurists normally expect to operate, to play a role in function. And also the issues as to where the initiative shall lie as between courts and legislature are extremely troublesome. They continually recur in many different ways in all developed legal systems. Good societies are committed to political democracy. So, his keyword in this essay is a political democracy, where we should find a proper context of a judicial law in delivering the wills of people. At what point does the creativity of judges become careless adventurism? When do judges undermine their own authority and respect for their own function by abrogating too much power to themselves? This can happen anywhere across the far reaching front of issues with which courts must deal. The general clauses then do not create these problems. They merely focus attention upon them. So, I have mentioned previously, the general clause have a foundation from the legislative authority. But I suggest that these clauses have also for the special temptation. For in form, they will, as I see them, express license judges to go out hunting anyway and bring back their trophy to be hung then in the living room. And more important, their search was described as the pursuit of moral values raised to a very high level and completely undefined. There are also some points of a consideration which we may define as one of dilemma, and the context come in a similar context as natural law in the common law counterparts. So that interplay was once touched upon in the previous class, as with the teachings of Rene David. So I now am available to start this class since my aide returned. So we should be interested in legitimate problems, so that would be a little more attention for the next class. And then with the substantive laws of a civil law tradition. Thank you for your attendance, and see you in the next class.